Good morning, everyone. Following another tall person, always good. Does he do a pretty good impression of Mike, Edwin, do we think? Can you work on the Welsh accent a little bit? I just want to hear a bit of that Welsh. Today we're looking at Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 14. Thank you. A certain Mr. John Campbell informs me that his Bible study is using the sermon as the basis for what they're studying. So if this makes no sense to you today, go and see John and see what he can do. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 to 14. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali if you like, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and, if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labour in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labour, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So today we're looking at the second part of my sermon series, which I've titled Signs of the Exodus. And if you missed part one, don't worry. I'm quite sure those who were here have forgotten every word. But I'll try and refresh their memory a little bit as we go on. So in this series we're looking at symbols, or as I'm calling them, signs, in the book of Exodus. And these signs point both backwards and forwards throughout the Bible. In the book of Exodus, we're going to look at the signs pointing from God's plan of salvation to God's ultimate plan to save mankind and glorify himself. You'll hear that line throughout the sermon. By the end of the sermon, you'll be actually finishing that sentence for me. His ultimate plan to save mankind and glorify himself. But if this sounds like I'm going to treat the book of Exodus as a myth or a legend or entirely a symbolic work of fiction, don't worry about that either, because I will be reminded, you know me well, don't you? You do know me. You know I'm not going to let you forget that we're talking about real people, real places, real events. I will be hammering that home. The book of Exodus, like the entire Bible, can do what no other book can do. It can be both symbolic and 100% historically accurate. That's what we're going to see. So you've heard our passage for this morning, Exodus chapter 1. We're going to take a close look at that passage this morning, because even here, at the very beginning of the Israelites' captivity, we're going to see signs. Some of these signs are numbers, actually. But the signs I want to concentrate on this morning, the signs I really want to focus on, are similarities. Not coincidences. Let's get that clear. Similarities. Similarities in the way the events of Exodus parallel or echo, if you like, other events in the scriptures, both before and after the book of Exodus. Similarities which point to God's ultimate plan to save mankind and to glorify himself. The time hasn't yet come to finish that sentence, but it will. And speaking of plans, we're going to look at other plans today, because these are plans that God's enemies made. Actually, they're our enemies too, God's enemies and our enemies. And they've made plans to destroy God's plans and make God's people captives. And yet these plans are actually a part of God's ultimate plan. And that sounds strange, doesn't it? Of course it does. But if anyone can do the strange kind, it's God. So let's begin now with our passage, starting with verses 1 to 5. We'll read that again. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. So here's a list of the 12 tribes of Israel and a grand total of 70 Israelites. Now, I'm looking around this morning. Most of you on the surface, at least, are pretty switched on people. Maybe it's just on the surface, but I hope it goes deeper than that. But I'm sure that your ears have pricked up already at the number 70, haven't they? And the 12 as well, I should say. The 12 and 70, you're right, I've got that down here. The 12 and the 70, your ears pricked up at that. Yeah, interestingly. In fact, there'll be a free biscuit for anyone who can tell me another time that 70 Israelites went to Egypt, a famous case. You won't find it in the Bible, but historians will tell you. Anyone who can come up to me after the service and tell me about that case will get a free biscuit. It may be dry, I don't know, if Jesse hasn't got to it already. But these numbers are signs, all right? They're definitely signs, but I haven't got time to go into them today, so we can talk about that later. Maybe another day, another sermon. But as we saw in my previous sermon, the Israelites joined Joseph in the land of Goshen. And this was prime real estate in Egypt. Goshen really was. It was a fertile, beautiful, protected part of the Nile Delta. You know what the Nile Delta is, when the river flows out to the sea across that flat land. Beautiful, fertile, really was the garden of Egypt. And as we also saw previously, the Israelites' time here is a sign pointing back to Adam and Eve's time in the Garden of Eden. And verse 7 says, the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, the words exceedingly and greatly make something very, very clear. This wasn't normal. It wasn't your average increase in population. To be blunt, the Israelites were breeding like rabbits here. That's exactly what was going on. Everything is going according to God's plan for Israel and according to his promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, verse 2. I will make you a mighty nation. And we're seeing the beginning of that here, aren't we? But everything is also going according to God's original plan for mankind. Here we have God's chosen people in a garden, multiplying exceedingly and greatly. It's a microcosm of the whole world as God intended. And this fulfillment of God's plan and God's promise for the Israelites is meant to remind us of God's plan for mankind. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, we see God says, be fruitful and increase in number. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the language is almost identical to Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. So already what we're seeing here is similarities between God's plan for the Israelites and God's plan for mankind as a whole. But the similarities don't stop there, because an enemy, as we all know, entered the Garden of Eden. And in the same way, an enemy is about to enter the Garden of Goshen. So let's look at the similarities between these cases, and we'll start with Eden. And this won't shock you, I'm sure, but it was Satan, Rick, who entered the Garden of Eden. You're not shocked, eh?
No.
Oh, good. Satan, the serpent of old, as he's called in more than one verse of the book of Revelation. And let's get this straight. Satan hates God. Satan was a usurper who wanted God's throne. So naturally, when Satan entered the Garden of Eden and saw what God had made and saw who God had made, Satan hated them. He hated Adam and Eve. Got that? We'll keep this in mind as we now come back to Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Do you all remember the Pharaoh who took Joseph out of prison, who made him the second most powerful man in Egypt? The man who welcomed the Israelites into the land of Goshen. You remember that Pharaoh? Mm-hmm. Good, forget about it. He's gone. What we have here is a new Pharaoh. I'm going to ask Doug to bring up an overhead here. That's not him, by the way. So you may be wondering why I've got that on the overhead. But the headdress that he's wearing was worn, scholars and historians believe, by the Pharaoh of the book of Exodus. And you'll observe the little snake on his headdress. The headdress itself is called a uraeus, and there's a little cobra on there. I don't want to go into this too much because you won't find it in the scriptures, but certainly you will find symbolism and signs, serpent imagery, if you like, in the book of Exodus. And I would love to go into all of this after the service, because I don't believe that headdress is just a coincidence that Pharaoh's wearing that. So again, no biscuit this time, but come and see me after the service. I'd love to go into that in detail. But up until I did this sermon, I thought that verse 8 was quite straightforward. I thought, if you've got, has anyone got the New King James or King James version with them? You have? And I think there it says, a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Is the word in there? NIV? Oh, my version of the NIV had Joseph meant nothing. Yes, so some people will have that. Yes, so there's two there anyway. One will say meant nothing, one will say did not know. And so I thought it was quite straightforward that this new Pharaoh, Joseph was already dead, he wasn't familiar with him, he may have heard of him, but really hadn't done his homework. I thought that was pretty straightforward, that's what it meant. But verse 8 also says, a new king. And scholars say that this phrase is not used anywhere else in the Bible to describe a successor to a king or to a previous ruler. And they say what this means is he wasn't a successor, but he was a usurper. Now, either way, I don't want to go into this too much either, but it just maybe puts a new light on that. Maybe he just hadn't done his homework, or that wasn't the problem. Maybe it wasn't that Joseph was dead. Maybe he just knew nothing about Egypt on the whole, and that's what's really going on here. But whatever the case is, the reality is that Joseph and the Israelites meant nothing to this new Pharaoh. Whatever the case is, usurper or successor, he means nothing and the Israelites mean nothing to him. What he sees is non-Egyptian people living in the prime real estate of Goshen, and he hates everything he sees about that. He's thinking, these foreigners here, under our noses, in the land of Goshen, worshipping some foreign god. What idiot allowed this? That's his reaction to it. He sees a multitude of God's people living peacefully in the garden, and all he sees is a threat to his throne and his power. Sound familiar? Well, it really should, based on what we've already looked at with Satan. Pharaoh's hatred of God's people points us back to Satan's hatred of mankind. The Israelites' enemy, who rose up to be Pharaoh over Egypt, is a sign pointing back to Satan, the serpent of old. We have good, Doug's taking that image down. The serpent who walked in or went into the Garden of Eden and looked upon all mankind as his enemy. We are meant to be reminded of this with the story of Pharaoh. But the similarities between Pharaoh and Satan don't end there. How do the scriptures describe the serpent Satan in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1? As cunning. And the new Pharaoh thinks he's pretty cunning too, pretty shrewd, in fact. Let's look at Exodus chapter 1, verse 9. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so Pharaoh develops a plan. And his plan is to enslave the Israelites, verse 11. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labour in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labour, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So it just repeats that there in case you weren't getting the picture there. Worked them ruthlessly. So the Israelites are now captives in Egypt. And you won't be surprised, following, when I tell you this captivity was a very real historical event. Doug's going to put up another image for us. Here's a map. I didn't have that a couple of weeks ago when I preached this at Sheffield, so I just had to vaguely point at a wall and get people to use their imagination. But here we have Pithom and Ramses just north of Goshen. And this is where the Egyptians put the Israelites to work. Even the name Pithom sounds a bit like a serpent. A little bit. Next image, Doug, if you don't mind. And here we will see the ruins of the mud brick, clay brick buildings the Israelites built. You could go there today if you were brave enough and see those ruins. Finding my spot. But as I said, these places are 100% real. All of this really happened just as the Bible describes it. The Israelites really were captives, just as Pharaoh had planned for. So this was Pharaoh's plan, but what about Satan's plan? It was the same as Pharaoh's. It was captivity for God's people. But not just one group of people. Satan's plan was captivity for all of mankind. So when Satan, the serpent of old, remember that? The serpent of old tempted Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Not an apple tree. No, thank you. The only tree that Adam and Eve had been told they were forbidden to eat from. He knew that this would result in their captivity, didn't he? He knew what the result would be. But not captivity and slavery under man, but captivity and slavery to sin. This was Satan's plan. And once again, these similarities aren't coincidences. God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he put the Israelites in the Garden of Goshen. And Satan entered the Garden of Eden, and Pharaoh entered the Garden of Goshen. And both of them saw the people there as a threat to their power. And so they plotted and they schemed and they tried to destroy God's plans. And from all appearances, it actually looks like they've succeeded at this point in the book of Exodus. Man is in captivity to sin, and the Israelites are in captivity in Egypt. So it looks like those plans have worked, hasn't it? So is it true? Have God's plans been destroyed? Well, we know the answer to that, don't we? Not by a long shot. Let's look again at verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Now, this increase in population, this isn't normal either, is it? You're not meant to thrive under the heavy burden of slavery and oppression. But that's exactly what happens. And it's interesting because I think this should remind us as well of the New Testament church. That's exactly what happened there. The more they were oppressed, the more the church grew. So you'll see a similarity with that as well. God uses persecution as part of his plans. That should encourage everybody here. And let's not forget that Pharaoh couldn't have risen to power unless God allowed it. Satan couldn't have entered the Garden of Eden unless God allowed it. Even before Satan planned, even before Pharaoh planned, even before the beginning of time, God's plans were in place. Think about that. And his plans included Satan and Pharaoh and their plans. God wanted to use their plans to save the Israelites. And as we're going to see, as we go further into this series in Exodus, we're going to see him do just that, save the Israelites from their captivity. The Israelites are going to become even mightier than Pharaoh feared. And Pharaoh himself is going to be destroyed. But what about Satan's plans, which brought mankind into captivity? How exactly is God going to use Satan's plans? Well, we did say, didn't we, that the book of Exodus points backwards and forwards throughout the scriptures. So let's move forward 1,000 years, roughly 1,000 years, to another example of captivity in the Bible. Just as we did in my previous sermon, which you've all forgotten about, that's fine. Let's visit the very real, very historical Garden of Gethsemane in the 1st century AD. And in this garden, we're going to find Jesus with his disciples. Now, Jesus has walked freely into this garden, but he's not going to walk out freely, because an enemy entered into the Garden of Gethsemane, the guards of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees themselves had looked upon God's own Son, and they hated what they saw. And they saw Jesus, no doubt about this, as a threat to their throne and power. Jesus was a thorn in their side. He contradicted their teachings. He'd even compared them to serpents, to quote the Gospels. He compared them to a brood of vipers. And so they'd all plotted and schemed for the whole of Jesus' ministry, and now, finally, they have him right where they want him, so they think. Arrested, brought to trial, and after false charges of blasphemy, hanging from a cross, dead. That's where Jesus is at this point. So, of course, the Pharisees and Sadducees thought they triumphed here. Their plans have succeeded, God's plans destroyed. And no doubt, Satan thought exactly the same thing. Yes, just as Pharaoh's plans had really been Satan's plans, so we'll see this with the Pharisees and Sadducees. I've said it before, I'm not going to say it again, I will say it again, I'm sure. There are no coincidences in the Bible. So when Jesus and earlier John the Baptist had compared the Pharisees and the Sadducees to a brood of vipers, to serpents, they knew exactly what they were doing. What they were really doing was accusing the Pharisees and the Sadducees of doing Satan's work. It was Satan who was working through the Jewish religious leaders, just as he'd worked through Pharaoh. It was Satan who was really behind Jesus' arrest and Jesus' captivity. And I think this time Satan really thought, I've finally done it. Yes, God rescued his people from captivity in Egypt. Yes, I know he's done all that. But this time, I've won. I've triumphed. I mean, why wouldn't he think that? Taking God's own son and putting him on a cross in shameful death. Surely this was Satan's ultimate victory over God. Of course it wasn't, was it, Steve? It was actually God's ultimate victory over Satan. As Jesus hung on the cross in agony and shame, our sin, the sin of every believer, hung there with him. And for every believer in Jesus Christ as Lord and Saviour, our sin stayed on the cross. It's still hanging there. But Jesus didn't stay on the cross. He rose again in glory and defeated death. Before Satan planned, even before the beginning of the world, God's plans were in place. And God used Satan's plans as part of his ultimate plan. And the death and resurrection of God's own Son was the ultimate fulfillment of God's ultimate plan, which is to save mankind and glorify himself. You are meant to finish that thought, but you will finish by saying Amen and Alleluia to that. Let's sing.